Hi everybody, Adam here from Audient, and today we're going to be showing you how to get your DAW set up with your ID interface. In today's video, we're going to be looking at Logic Pro. So first things first, we're going to need to connect our interface. I recommend doing that first. If you've got any speakers or monitors, leave the headphones unplugged for now, leave the monitors switched off whilst we do the rest. We don't want any kind of clicks and pops causing any issues down the road. So we're going to plug in, I have an ID14 here, but the process is the same with an ID4. Plug the USB-C cable into your Mac or PC. If it's a Mac, it may be a USB-C on the other end. If it's a PC, it may be USB-A, which is the larger square connection. Both should work exactly the same. If you're doing this with an ID44, you'll need to plug in the AC connection at the same time. Now, whilst it is possible to use an ID interface with some limited functionality just by plugging it straight into the computer, we highly recommend going to the Audient website and getting the latest drivers. This means that you will have maximum compatibility, full functionality, and everything that the interface can do will be available to you. So let's go to the Audient website now. Once we are at the audient.com website, we can go to the top to products and find the link to the audio interface that we're using. In my case, the ID14. Having said that, whether you're using an ID4, 14 or 44, the drivers are the same and can be used across the entire range. Now we're on the ID14 page, we can go to downloads at the top right, and that will give us both the documentation, so the manual and the start guide, as well as the macOS drivers and the Windows drivers. Download the relevant one, install them through that process, and I'll see you back here shortly. Once that's installed, you may need to run the ID app at the first time, but this may come up automatically when you plug in the ID interface. The first time you do this, it will come up with the Arc Creative Hub window, where we have some fantastic software and tutorials available to you as you register your interface. I'm already a member, so I'm just going to close this window. Now I can see the ID mixer in front of me. This comes up for the ID14 and 44, but for the ID4, everything is done on the front of the interface. No mixer required. At this point, I'm going to plug in a microphone and then get that ready to use in my DAW. Now here's one I prepared earlier. This is a vocal microphone that needs 48 volt phantom power. On the front of each unit is a 48 volt switch per channel, so I'm going to turn that on the channel 1, which is where I have this connected. On the ID4, the 48 volt control is on the rear of the unit. Once the microphone is powered, we're going to need to adjust the gain on the front of the interface until we see reasonable levels. Now on the ID14 and 44, we can see in the ID mixer now on screen that there is appropriate level coming in, if not a little much. On the ID4, we move the monitor DAW knob all the way to the left, and then on the LEDs on the front of the unit, we should then be able to see the levels moving as needed. Now we have our microphone plugged in and ready to go. Let's fire up Logic. Now Logic by default comes up with the previous project, so we're going to make something new in just a minute. But first, I'm going to make sure that the settings are all correct so that Logic is using the ID interface and not by default the inbuilt interface or anything else. So we need to go to Logic Pro, Preferences, and Audio. Now in here, we need to make sure that Core Audio is enabled, and then we choose an output device, which in this case is the Audient ID14. That will then select the same input device so that we're using inputs and outputs on the same thing. And then we need to talk about the I/O buffer size. Buffers are related to latency. So, latency is about if we are listening to a track through Logic live. So if we have headphones on or we're listening through speakers, let's say this microphone that's in my hand, we're hearing that through Logic. So we can do things like use compressors, equalizers, all that kind of lovely stuff in Logic. That's great. That does incur a very slight delay whilst the computer does that processing. You may find that the latency is a bit too much and that the slight delay is quite disorienting. In this case, we change our I/O buffer size to be smaller. Personally, I find that 128 works well for me in this circumstance. It's low enough that I'm not feeling that delay anymore, but conversely, if you have too many tracks going on, too much processing with plugins, you may find that your computer starts to struggle and you start to get pops and clicks and dropouts and other errors. Now, by turning the buffer size up, that should then give the computer more breathing room. And that means that there's less chance of any dropouts when you're doing really complicated stuff, but also there is that latency that comes back. But generally my advice would be, if you're recording a few channels and there's not much going on, make the I/O buffer size small. If you're doing a large mix and you're not recording anymore, then increase the I/O buffer size to suit. Once you're set up with all this, make sure you hit the apply button down here, and that will then switch from whatever interface it was using previously to the ID interface. At this point, I'm going to quickly delete this track out of here to show you what happens with a new Logic project, and by default it comes up asking me to choose a track type. So I'm choosing audio here, and then the audio input, I have this microphone plugged into input 1, so I'm choosing input 1, and the audio output, which is 1 and 2, which by default go out of the monitor outputs and also out of the headphone outputs. That could be changed, but that is more advanced. I'm going to click create, and then our track comes up with record enabled. That's the R button. If that needs to be pressed, you can press that, and then you will see your levels come up if your microphone is set. So we can see that in Logic, everything's ready to go. Now I could just hit record at this point. One sticking point is that I can't hear it, and that is to do with monitoring. So at this point, this is where we would turn on our speakers or plug in our headphones, and then by default, the ID series have their volume down so that we don't cause any big pops, bangs, explosions. So we click on the speaker icon or the headphone icon and then turn up the rotary encoder until that's at a level that works for you. From here, you still may not be able to hear anything, but now we're looking back at Logic. This is software monitoring. So if we click the I button, now we'll be able to hear this coming through Logic and through the EQ, through the audio effects, through anything that you want to do with it. That's with that little bit of that buffer latency. If we need this to be not latency at all, with near zero latency, we can turn off this input monitoring and we can go to the ID mixer and we can turn up a fader. So we can turn this up on mic 1 and we will then hear that through the headphones or the monitors, and balance this. If this is the 44, then there are significantly more of these faders that you can turn up. At this point, you may come across a phenomenon that I call ghosting, which is where the same audio comes out twice. It sounds like a chorusing effect, a doubling effect, kind of a hollow robotic effect. That usually happens when we're hearing the same audio through Logic and through the ID mixer. So we need to make a choice of which one we want to use, whether it's zero latency without the processing or whether it's with latency but with the processing that we need. So we need to either turn down the fader in the ID app, or we need to mute the track in Logic as we record it. That will fix that issue. And that's it. Any questions you've got, please feel free to leave a comment down in the section below, or feel free to reach out to us at Audient and through our support team. Thanks everybody for watching, good luck, and have fun.